Good evening, virtual audience. Welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Marisa LaFleur, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm very pleased to introduce this event with John Archibald presenting his book, Shaking the Gates of Hell, A Search for Family and Truth in the Wake of the Civil Rights Revolution, joined in conversation by Roy Wood Jr. I hope you're all safe and hanging in there. Thank you for joining us virtually. Through virtual events like this one, Harvard Bookstore is continuing to bring authors and their work to our community and our more wider digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we will be hosting events here on our Zoom account. As always, our event schedule also appears on harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from your home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting links to purchase Shaking the Gates of Hell at harvard.com, as well as to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore, so thank you for showing up and tuning in. In support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore, we really appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last many months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers.
All right, so I will take it away.
No, sorry.
No, not yet.
Okay. Not yet. John Archibald is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and columnist for the Birmingham News. His column focuses on Alabama and Birmingham politics. He has also written for the Huntsville Times and the Pre-Register, among others. When he received the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 2018, his work was described as lyrical and courageous commentary that is rooted in Alabama but has a national resonance. We'll be in conversation tonight with comedian Roy Wood Jr., who is currently a correspondent on Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Trevor Noah, and who has performed nationally on stage, television, and radio. He is originally from Birmingham, Alabama, and was named one of the 10 comics to watch in 2016 by Variety magazine. Tonight, the two will be discussing John's debut book, Shaking the Gates of Hell, which reckons with John's past and family history as a son of a Methodist preacher in Alabama during the heart of the Civil Rights Movement. The book was featured yesterday on the New York Times New and Noteworthy list, and the New York Journal of Books describes it as an affecting blend of memoir and history. Shaking the Gates of Hell offers an unflinching account of a family in a tumultuous time. We're so pleased to have them both here with us tonight, and now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, John and Roy.
Thank you.
Okay, now I can talk. Now we can talk, John. First and foremost, I guess this is always the boilerplate question in these types of conversations. Where are you and how are you handling the pandemic?
Oh man, I'm actually in Cambridge, Mass, about a quarter mile from the Harvard Bookstore. So, and crazily, it's 46 degrees today, which is the equivalent of about 82 in Alabama, I think. So it's a beautiful day.
Yeah, I'm in Manhattan. They opened the swimming pools. It got to 60 yesterday. It was
man.
insane. Well, thank you so much. First and foremost, as a Black person, I want to thank you for writing this book because, and I know there's a lot of different prisms that we can explore, but the reason why I feel like this book is important is that within the Black community, the conversation, there's always a conversation about what other people could be doing if they claim to be an ally, if you claim to care about Black issues, if you claim to think that racism is bad, there are a lot of us who do what we can, and there are a lot of people who are allies of the Black community who are doing what they can, but it doesn't always come from a place of it's not always from the most informed place. And so the thing that we've always said, at least I've always said in my family, and that has always been said, in my circle of friends, is that stopping any form of oppression and bigotry starts with your circle. It starts with you first, And then it starts with the people immediately in your circle. Those recent phone calls in your phone, it starts with those people. And then we can get out into talking about voting and did you donate to the thing and did you go march for the thing? Like those things are all beneficial and help. But when we talk about really questioning why we believe the things we believe and challenging people on that, I think that this book is, it's a beautiful introspection into someone who's not Black, taking a journey into themselves. And then through that journey, it's impossible to learn yourself without reassessing the people around you. And I would assume that's what happened, as you kind of took stock of the relationship between you and your father. But I want to start with the question, just I guess a real base question, because we're both, sons of the South. When were you first cognizant of racism as not necessarily the first time you saw racism, but the first time you saw, wow, I think those people are getting treated a little differently from me and Dad?
I think, and it took me a long time to figure this out. It took me until I was writing this book to figure this out because, and the reason I really wanted to write this book is because when I found I expected, and I think a lot of white people do, they look at their families and they love them, and then their families love them back, and they think that, oh, this could never be us. I mean, we could not be the ones who are responsible for things that took place in the 60s or let's face it, 400 years ago or any of that. So we don't want to do that. So, and that was reinforced in me because my dad was really emphatic that I would go to integrated schools as soon as integrated schools were available in Decatur, Alabama, which was when I was in second grade when they desegregated. So I grew up in a situation where I was always around Black and white people, which is what, counted as diversity in Alabama in 1972. Mm-hmm. And so I think the first time is when I was in Cub Scouts, which, and frankly, my dad helped integrate the Cub Scouts in Decatur, Alabama. And we had a Cub Scout leader who, taught us about Marcus Garvey and things like that, which was rare at the time. But
it's still rare.
It is still rare. But
it was rare then, it's still rare now.
But honestly, the first time I remember being completely shocked was when this guy played football with me at Banks High School in Birmingham, Alabama, not far from where you went to grammar school. And we were just hanging out. He was a friend of mine, a Black friend of mine. And I went, and we just drove over to my girlfriend's house at the time. And, went up and knocked on the door. And the girlfriend's father wouldn't let us in because there was a Black dude on his front steps, and he went nuts. And I'd never seen anything like it in my life. I'd never experienced anything like it in my life. And I was shocked, and it stuck with me forever. And it, and that would have never happened in my household, which is why I was so disappointed. And the book is essentially about trying to find out what my father said from the pulpit, because I was able to find every sermon he'd ever given during the civil rights movement, beginning before I was born in April of 1963, which is that moment in time Dr. King wrote the letter from the Birmingham jail excoriating the white church for its silence on the issue of race, in addition to beautifully laying out, reasons for protest and demonstration. But so the person I knew at home did not match, as it turned out, the person who was always talking in those sermons, because there was a real silence there on the days of great importance, whether that be the Children's Crusade in Birmingham or the Selma Montgomery March or the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, these critical moments in history. And he was talking about, problems in Asia and Africa, and not outside the stained glass doors of his church, which was 23 miles from the jail where Dr. King was held. So I wanted to know, how could this person I thought was better than that, and I still do, how could that happen? And it was a conspiracy of silence. And you know what that is like down there among, people who don't stand up and say what needs to be said.
Well, the courage to step up and say what's right is rarely without consequence. And so, we live in a time, and I would say that, these times now are very similar to the penalties are very similar, rather. The penalty for speaking out on something that's wrong could come at personal loss. It could come at threats. It could come, it could come under the guise of a lot of different forms. But when we talk about white silence and this idea that there are good people who say nothing, and answering the question of, are they still good people? Your father, when you first found these sermons, because I guess what was your relationship with your father? Your father seemed like a great person, seemed like he did everything the right way. What was it about this finding the sermons that just kind of took you aback? Because I would assume that was the moment where that was the genesis point of you going, okay, this exploration needs to be put into a book.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was very clear to me when I looked at when my dad was a preacher of a church right outside Birmingham, Alabama, in April of 1963, when I was born, when Dr. King was in jail, when thousands of children were being arrested in the streets, thousands of Black children were being arrested in the streets for marching for civil rights and for equality in Birmingham, Alabama. And I saw that my dad preached that week on what was on the church calendar, Children's Sunday. It was Children's Sunday, so he would preach about children at this moment in time in what we now call the Children's Crusade. And the only mention of children was innocuous and vague and not at all about the things that were going down in Birmingham, Alabama. And that struck me as, I mean, how can you look beyond that and not make mention of it in a day when you're talking about children and what we still consider to be the cradle of the civil rights movement at this incredibly important time in history. And so that began, and what you said about consequences is absolutely true. Every preacher of his generation I asked about it said, well, the consequences were great if you preached about integration in that particular time. You'd be looking for another church next week. You'd be shipped out to North Carolina.
Congregation will vote you out or whatever.
Yeah, and in the Methodist church, it works a little bit differently, but you would be relegated to a small church, or and there was great fear, and that happened to a lot of people. But they told me this as if it was supposed to make me feel better, but all it did is make me feel as if I were part of the reason for the silence, which I know that that was not what he believed, but it was what he felt he could say. And that's a problem, and a much greater problem than my father. It's the problem within the church and with the institution and with the white community. And it was beyond the church. I mean, people were punished all the time, but the question becomes, and I asked the question as you did, can you be a good person and not use your pulpit, whatever that pulpit is, for real change? And it's a tough question because goodness comes in a lot of ways, but you can certainly not be as good as you could be.
There's an analogy that I like to, I don't know if it's not a spot on analogy, but it's something that it makes sense to me. I didn't know this until the floods in Houston a couple of years ago. I don't remember the name of the hurricane, but the Gulf gets one every 2 to 3 years. So whatever hurricane that was, they had video on CNN, and it was a colony of fire ants floating in one big ball just in the floodwaters. Their colony had been flooded, And these ants had all interlocked. And essentially, what fire ants do to survive in a flood, they rotate from the top back to the bottom. Some drown, but most make it through, and it keeps the ball afloat. But everybody takes a turn being on the bottom, and there's a degree of selflessness within this species of insect that these insects on the bottom are willing to die if need be to make sure that there is something good that will still happen going forward. Whereas I feel like as humans, we are not like fire ants in any capacity, shape, form whatsoever. I truly believe this, that there are to be human and to be moral is to act against the instinct of self-preservation. Because in a lot of instances, to be moral also means that you are putting yourself at risk and you are doing something that could, if I'm going to play devil's advocate for your father, I got a family. The church pays me a salary. I don't want to go to Boone, North Carolina, or Cary, or Wrightsville Beach, or some other small town. No disrespect to anyone in the webinar that is from North Carolina. Wrightsville Beach, a wonderful place. That does that not help? Does knowing that truth about us as humans, does that help at all in any capacity to put you at some level of maybe a little bit of understanding of why those choices were made?
No, hell no. Because I mean, that's the reason it was given to me by everybody as an explanation to make me feel better. And it did not make me feel better, because all I can think of is you're telling me that you're in a position of authority, a spiritual guide to people. You've sworn to, you've taken, this calling from God, and it's too much of a threat that you will not be able to move to a larger church, or that you will be moved to a smaller church, while John Lewis and Fred Shuttlesworth are getting beaten with in the head, where people are getting killed all over the place, where people are making great sacrifices to change the world. And largely, by and large, and I mean, if you look at the original Selma and Montgomery, there were very few white people participating. There were very few. There were very few people in Birmingham white people in Birmingham marching. There were very few people who took any risk at all. And it was a huge conspiracy, and people were afraid. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. It's not. I mean, we'll call it peer pressure if you don't like the word conspiracy, which is a lot like ants, which I would say you're wrong, that they're not entirely like, that humans are not entirely like ants, because they certainly do bite, I guess, but and they interfere with your picnic. But I think that in the face of people who made real sacrifice, Dr. King is dead. So many are, and for people to, it's not about sacrifice, it's about, I'm making this choice for convenience. You make this for convenience and to live a more comfortable life. And that is, I think that's against what most of these people were preaching in a more vague sense. In the more vague sense that you love everybody, all the little children, red and yellow, black and white. Jesus loves the little children, but they got to go over there and we got to go over here. And it's in Congress, and none of it makes any sense if you justify silence in that regard. But it's why it happened.
For the people who don't know, is your father still with us?
No, he's not. He died in 2013, which is why I had his files in my basement. And I would like to say that, I love him dearly and still respect him dearly, and think he's in the 99th percentile of goodness of anybody in the world. And he, which is why I thought it was so important to look at this and to find out why. And because when we can look at the people we admire the most and see the flaws in them, then it's a lot easier to look at ourselves and see them too. And a lot of people think the book is about my dad, but the book is told through my dad, but it's about us right now in society today who are struggling to try to find ways to talk.
Of the people that you talked to who were reflecting on their time, during this, of the pastors that you spoke to who were reflecting on that time, and you asked them, to kind of, walk me through why you made those choices, did you get any sense of regret from any of them in regards to their white silence, or was it just more about it was what it was anyway? What's for dinner?
It varied, but mostly there was regret. There was a good deal of regret and almost universal agreement that the silence existed and that the silence was wrong, and that it had to change. But it changed so slowly. There were people who weren't silent, who spoke up. Many often got visits from the Klan and calls from their in the Methodist Church. You have preachers, and a district superintendent would be somebody over them in the hierarchy, and who would be their boss essentially. And they would get calls from their district superintendent saying, "Why you got to keep preaching on these race issues, or like the race problem," they called it at the time, the race question, and so that they really discouraged that. And which is the same reason, Dr. King wrote that letter, because all the white clergy wrote to him saying, you don't need to protest. It's not time. It's, let's talk this out. You don't need to do this. And so wait forever, as and he knew that the justice delayed is justice denied. So I lost my train of thought on that. I'm sorry, but
no, you answered the question. I just find it interesting. Like, part of me has always felt like, so my father, for the people who don't know, my father was, he was a civil rights journalist, from an era that preceded, any type of Black people being, on radio on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. And, he was, you can go all the way back to the 50s to, the Civil War and then Rhodesia. Soweto, he was there for the riots. He was embedded with Black soldiers in Vietnam when some of their platoon, we all know the story of Black platoons and the way they were treated overseas. And so, my father was embedded with a lot of those gentlemen, came home and was working at the National Black Network, and which, for its time, for those of you who don't know, the National Black Network was essentially the Black CNN. It was a syndicated Black radio network that essentially disseminated news and opinions that were specifically addressed African Americans. If this issue is not pertinent to our community, it's not getting covered on NBN. And so when my father left NBN, he went to New York for a little while in the 80s, before eventually settling down in Birmingham. And so he had seen racism through a lot of different prisms, because he saw it domestically. And, any civil rights photo you can find, my daddy was 3 rows back with a tape recorder. But then he saw it in Africa. He saw it over in Vietnam. And he came into Birmingham with not nearly as much resentment as I would think a man of his travels should have against the system, but more as a man that was, really solution minded and trying to figure out ways to just uplift people. Like, the problem is out there, but what can I do right now that will just help just one person or one little thing along? And like my father, when we're talking about just racism and discussing it, as 2 children in the South with, parents who were clearly cognizant of it and clearly wanted something to be different. I often wonder if my father raised me aware of racism. He raised me to be aware of my own power to be able to succeed and grow in spite of it, but he never passed on hatred or resentment. That was never given to me, you know? And that's the one thing that, I'll tell you this story. So I had a sixth grade classmate, and at the time I lived in West End, but I was going to middle school at WJ Christian in Roebuck, which
Where
on
are
a
we?
regular school. Okay, so so then you know that is
I'm
a
older
journey.
than you. Yeah, that's quite a trip.
That's a 2-hour school bus ride. I'm on the bus at 6 for 8 o'clock first bell, and I had a classmate and we were really good friends, and we wanted to do a play date on a Saturday. And at the time, Roebuck was a much whiter part of town than it is today. But it was, it was white middle class. There were some black people starting to, trickle in there. But West End was still black. We lived in, at the time, I don't know if it still is, statistically the most violent zip code in the city. So my white classmate's daddy is not driving all the way to West End. And my daddy, just knowing what I know now, just to be over there, and I don't want to get pulled over. So I'm not driving you to Roebuck. So my father and this man's father, they both get on the phone and they have a conversation about where to meet. And it's mind blowing now to even grasp that this was a regular conversation between a white man and a black man. Yeah, I don't trust your neighborhood. I don't trust your neighborhood. All right, but we both want our kids to hang out and not do racism when they're older, right? Right. Okay. Well, meet me at Rogers Army Navy store on First Avenue North. And that was the halfway point that they agreed upon. And so every time I wanted to hang out with one of my buddies who was white, who lived in Roebuck, I got passed off like it was literally like a kidnapping deal. Like, show me the kid, you show me the money, walk to the car. It's interesting though, and my point in bringing all of that up is that it's interesting in how to have parents that are in that fight and you're completely aware of that fight, but to carry it one way within yourself, but to still try to instill some level of morality in your children, because that's what it sounds like with your father. It sounds like it was more of a, do as I say, not as I do type relationship.
Well, but the thing about it is with him, he was doing those things. He was integrating, and again, this is what was so hard for me. He was integrating scout troops and making sure that the black preachers in the church were involved with his church, and he was doing things throughout the years that was happening. But then he would, in the sermons themselves, we can debate what's more important, whether it's more important to stand up and speak in church or whether it's important to go do physical things. But the sheer silence of it was just so deafening to me. When were you in grammar school? Sixth grade? Was that?
That was 1988.
Okay.
That was 1988.
So that's significantly after mine. But to me, the big difference, it's hard for people to understand. Maybe it's not hard for people to understand because we like to think sometimes that this only happens in the South and this only happens in Alabama, and we know now that that's not true. But like I said earlier, I was in an integrated school from second grade through high school, and when I graduated high school, Banks High School, like I said, it was 50% white and 50% black. And it was a great experience, and it helped to form me. The next year, of course, it went to 51% black, and then in 5 years, it was all black. And then they closed it down. And so, and it's funny, and it's just horrible. And what we have lost since we resegregated, Alabama, by and large, resegregated its entire school system, and not because of government action, because people, we went to WJ Christian. I went to WJ Christian when it was just a regular elementary school. You probably went when it was a magnet school. Middle school where all the smartest kids in town came. but anyway,
here's what I find interesting about you. And so I did morning radio. Again, this is just a quick little nonsensical backstory for the people watching. So I did morning radio, and the thing that we did in Birmingham for the 12, 13 years that I was on air, the Birmingham News became the place to find the one or two local stories and to always find what people in the city were mad about. You know, I started mornings in '01. This is before social media is what it is today. Like the internet in those days was just where you went to print directions and find someone to date. It was very basic. Like YouTube wasn't even a thing yet at that time. Your columns were always about the right thing and holding people accountable. That was just like, we would just read the column. I go, okay, we're going to talk about that today on the show. That's a good topic. We could ride this topic for 3 hours, but we only have 20 minutes. So like, as you in your journey of trying to hold people accountable, because I don't think that this is something that's strictly to you exploring this issue of white silence. It's the issue of people who don't do the right thing. And why don't they do the right thing? And what motivates you to do wrong? Where does your family sit?
They're very supportive. They're very supportive. You know, and that's in a crazy, crazy way. I mean, brothers, sisters, daughters, sons, wife, I mean, everybody, cousins, they all appreciate the fact that, you know, we're talking about this. But, you know, I think that the accountability thing, I mean, the most difficult part for me in writing this book, where I hold the person I'm, you know, I think it's the most, you know, best person I've ever known accountable, is that it requires me, and it required me to heavily look at myself and look at the moments when I didn't say the things that I needed to say, or you know, and I, you know, writing an opinion column, you write, you know, you've read me enough to know that I can say I can be right and I can be wrong, and you know, I can live with the times I've been wrong, because if you write an opinion, sometimes you're going to be wrong. But to think of those times that I, you know, there, and of course there have been times where I didn't have the courage to say the things that needed to be said. And those are the things that really bother me now. And I look back at seemingly little things. I mean, you know, there was a time, there's a story in the book about when my future wife, my current wife, met my sister, and my sister made some comment about my brother and how you know, he was going to stop smoking because, you know, all those gay men in New York are going to stop or getting fit. This was in the 80s. And then she said, oh, to my wife, to the girlfriend at the time, oh, did John not tell you that Murray's gay? And my wife just said, oh, of course, which was completely untrue, because I had never mentioned that in my life, not because I really thought I wanted to keep it secret. This was, again, like 83 or 84, 85. But because I always found a reason to not talk about it. There was always a good reason to just not even think about it and bring it up, because I didn't cross all these streams. And that just ate me up over the course of time, because, you know, it felt like I was just being disloyal. It felt like I was being traitorous to my brother by not, you know, having the courage or whatever it was to just, you know, say, hey, this is my brother, he's gay, you know, or whatever. And people say, well, why do you beat yourself up about that? And it's because I felt like I was traitorous about it. And I think that those things eat us up. If you're a person of principle or conscience, and you don't stand up, and you know the moments that they don't have to be about great and large issues, but they're important to us, to me.
Well, if you're a person of morals, then, and you're not speaking out, then it has to eat at you one way or another. Otherwise, I'm not sure if you're human. I want to open up to some questions. We're taking questions in the Q&A tab if you want to join in. There's two. This first one, this one's a doozy, but it's also the most important question that I think someone could ask. What do you think is the most important thing white people can do to confront the histories of racism within their own families?
Well, I think that
That's a deep. We talking about how you rehab the whole family tree, John. Come on.
you can't. You know, the best question is to start, and because I think back to this, and there's a fear of opening up a box of old letters sometimes. If you're a white person in the South, particularly, and you're reading old letters from your grandfather, your great grandfather, or the great great grandfather before that, you find out owned slaves and did this. I mean, we want to just believe that we're different and better, and that we weren't a part of the problem that helped create and maintain slavery and Jim Crow and everything else. But you have to open that box and you have to look in order to find out. I was amazed because I was scared to death as I was doing this, honestly. I was scared to death because I love my family more than anything. And I love my extended family, as well. And when I talk about a grandfather, they have a stake in that game too. But I have been so amazed because, we went through these letters, which we got from extended family. We went through documents, we went through sermons, and found these things, and ended up, writing a very, very uncomfortable piece, a book that looked at it. And the response from all its family has been overwhelmingly good. So I think that being able to have a conversation, being able to see the good in somebody while still recognizing the failings is the key.
Okay, let me 1B that question then. Because we're in a time now where people just going to believe what they want to believe. And if you're a white person, you're trying to have this logical discussion. Hey, this is happening to this group of people. We need to say something about it, or we at least need to acknowledge that this is happening. Comedian Mike Birbiglia said something that really struck me. He was talking about jokes, but I think it works the same about progress, is that progress only happens when everybody agrees on the truth or agrees on the premise. A joke only works if everyone agrees on the premise. And I think that progress, in a way, has to work like that as well. Is there ever a point where, and I'm not trying to turn you into the white people whisperer expert man, but there are a lot of January 6th showed us that there are a lot of people entrenched in what they are going to believe and what their truth is going to be going forward. And if you are a member of that family, is there any getting through to that type of person, or do you just focus on the generations that are coming after? Like, if you can't save granddad, is it about talking to the younger cousins? Is it about talking to the grandchildren? Or is it just setting an example and hoping that eventually, granddad comes on board at some point?
Yeah, I mean, these times are as difficult as any as I've ever seen. So it's very difficult. So I may not have an answer for that, but I can have a philosophy for that. And it's a philosophy about that really is formed through my writing, that has seeped into my life. And I think it's one you share as well, because we can both be very passionate about both things, but we also believe that it's really important to bring some kind of humor or humanity. If you can talk about something in a really important issue and make them laugh at the same time, they can disagree with you, but they can see your humanity. And so we've gotten to this point right now where everybody is so this way or that way that they don't see the humanity in each other at all. So as a strategic point of view, I would say, I'm going to tell you what I really think, but then I'm going to try to make you smile about something I said, or I'm going to try to entertain you in some way along the way, so that at least you won't cut me off entirely and go away. So, I mean, I think that's true. That's my philosophy about it.
So there's a couple more questions in the Q&A, but I'm going to jump ahead to Elaine's question because it kind of dovetails off of what you were saying. You kind of answered the front half of it, just in terms of, there's people that are going to just say it's a liberal fad and systemic racism isn't real. But the back half of the question is interesting. And Do you engage in conversations with these people or avoid them knowing that you are not going to change anyone's mind? My philosophy has always been, if you can at least leave this conversation with more information, and with that information you still choose to feel that way, then I've done the most I could at that point. So, if you know that you're fighting a losing battle, do you still engage, John?
Not always. I mean, I've always had the philosophy that I would talk to anybody, and I think that that's an important philosophy. It's much more difficult now, and it goes back to that question where I mean, we were talking about earlier when I lost my train of thought when we were talking about your elementary schools. But I think the importance of, I mean, I think that a lot of here's the deal, and I was going to ask you this question. I've lived in the South since 1963 when I was born, and I've never seen racism as strident and as on the surface as it is today. And I wonder if you feel that as well. And so it feels a lot to me today in some ways, despite a lot of progress over the last couple of years. In some ways, progress, regress. It seems a lot like the 60s. But to answer Elaine's question, yeah, it's important to engage, but it's very difficult, and you have to choose where you engage. And I don't tend to engage on social media, as I will always engage in person.
Yeah, social media, you're asking for it. I don't know if you noticed my daily my Twitter feed. I'll retweet segments that I do from the Daily Show, but I'm not just posting regular political stuff. If you go up there right now, I'm talking about food and child remote learning, because I have a 4-year-old who learned how to unmute himself on Zoom and make fart noises and disrupt the class. I just, to what Elaine is talking about, I'll tell you a story, and these are the type of people that they're up against. So when I was 19 and going to college at Florida A&M, I got arrested for stealing some jeans. And that's a pretty well-known part of my backstory.
I got arrested for stealing a box of condoms, so we got that. Mine's worse.
Didn't even get to use them because you had to go to jail. Oh, Archibald. So I get arrested, and I got arrested the night before Thanksgiving. And so when you get arrested before a holiday, you sit in jail until it's supposed to be until Monday, but for whatever reason, that particular week, Leon County had a Friday judge. And so the U.S. Marshals come in and transport everybody from the county jail down to the courthouse for their arraignment or, whatever. And on the ride to the bail hearing, just on the ride, and it's 20 minutes from Appleyard Drive to downtown Tallahassee, I got called the N-word probably 30 times on this van by the dude that was driving. He's saying it to everybody, but he's really zeroed in on me. And I'm 19, I'm scared. This is my first, I don't know what to do. I'm petrified. And the thing he kept saying to me was, you go in there and don't say a word. Don't say a word. Shut your mouth. But there's N-word. Put an N-word wherever you want in that phrase, and you'd probably be verbatim to what happened. And so I go in, and it's you've been arrested. Are you going to run or not? Should we let you out until trial or no? And this man instructed me to say nothing, and just in a switch flips, and I just go, you know what? No, I'm going to say something. And I spoke up, and I'm in school, and it was a mistake, blah blah blah. And the man let me out on the pretrial release or whatever. And you have to go back to get processed. And this same man that drove the van called me an N-word for another 30 minutes. And that was 1998.
Wow.
Fast forward 6 months, and thankfully I was given probation and opportunity to get back in school, and I got my degree, and then happily ever after. But not even 6 months after that, I'm working at Golden Corral as a server, and there's a table of law enforcement officers there. and he's one of the people. And you don't, as a Black person, you don't forget that. You don't forget the face. You remember everything. I remember the suspenders. I remember the eyebrows. Like I could draw this man. To this day, I could draw him. And look me in the eyes as I'm serving, completely polite and kind, tipped 30%, which infuriated me even more because it means you're either a liar or you don't remember. You straight up just don't remember. And someone like that, I don't know if you can sit him down and show him a couple episodes of John Oliver and change his perspectives,
Right.
On the world. But I think that's kind of what they're talking about. There's a couple more questions here. I want to make sure we get to all of them before the top of the hour. John, where do you see hope in the race question, as your dad would say?
Yeah, well, I have real problems with that terminology because it's not a question. It's, it's my dad. It's what all they all used at that particular time, all the preachers. But the hope, I think that last year, as miserable as everybody thinks 2020 was, there was a lot of hope generated, in the summer, and that came in, maybe some people here won't know, but in a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama, Mountain Brook, the wealthiest city in Alabama, almost 100, almost entirely white. To see, it's a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but to see, 1,000 white people kneeling in the Mountain Brook Elementary School lawn, pictures of that is pretty stunning in Alabama, to honor George Floyd. So there was a time, it may have been a brief moment in time, and we may have again regressed on that, but to see how many people began to notice that Black people are treated differently by law enforcement than white people is a remarkable achievement. That people across Alabama are talking in wonderful terms to me about writing about issues of race and LGBTQ issues is remarkable. And then there are a lot that won't. We know that. That's okay. But the numbers of people who are willing to simply stand up and say, this is what I believe. Because that's all we're talking about. People who are saying, this is what I believe. I'm not asking you to yell. I'm not asking you to shout. I'm not asking you to protest. I'm asking you to use whatever voice you have and whatever personality you have within, whatever makes you comfortable to be able to say, this is what I believe. And this is what we should do. That is hopeful.
No, that is. If you're at least an inch further along, I'll take it. Right. At least there's a lot more people acknowledging that something's happening. I want to make sure we get to these last two questions because the second one is a doozy. The third one, okay, yeah, we'll get these last three. This will be the last three. What surprised you the most in the process of writing this book and reflecting on your family? I guess you kind of answered it a little bit already.
There's a lot that surprised me. It's fairly complicated. Because I went into it with this illusion that we were, the Archibalds, we were somehow different because, I came, like I said, I got preachers in my family all the way back to the 1750s. It did surprise me to learn that, it didn't really surprise me to find out that, fairly prominent white family in the 1700s in the South had slaves, but it was never something that we had been taught or learned. But I think that what surprised me the most was just how absent the words of justice were in the churches themselves, not just my father's, but essentially 90% of the white churches in Alabama, completely void. It just didn't happen. And we wonder why the silence persists. But I keep wanting to talk about the fact that, we went to school in our elementary schools, 15 years apart, I guess. But I went during this sort of age of integration. I like to think of this golden age of integration. I'm like the one generation in Alabama that went entirely through integrated schools. And almost everybody else I know really didn't. I mean, there might be some kids of one race and some of them are another, but most of the schools,
especially in Birmingham, where the school system, the city versus county, started getting extremely one-sided in terms of racial majority. Like Birmingham City's predominantly Black, top to bottom.
And I think that's a huge, huge loss, because the one thing that we have to do is get to know each other as real people, and that's in your formative years, that is so extremely important. Then that whole quality of otherness disappears, and I don't know how to bring that back, because there's such effort to keep it that way. Whether it's through property values, whether it's through rezoning, whether it's through city limits, there's 1,000 different ways that we do it, and it's killing us.
So that goes perfectly into this next question, which is one that I often, as a Black person, I often deal with this one. Individual conversations and actions are important, but do you think there's a limit to how much we can push back against racism as citizens without change at the policy and leadership level?
Well, when you have voter suppression and when you have active movement to, resegregate or to take funding from public schools and put them into private schools that don't have the same requirements, I think that all those things are terribly detrimental. They cause distrust, and they cause injustice. So that's a real problem. But again, go ahead.
I think there's only so much you can do as one person, but I do think in conjunction with policy change, for lack of a better example, I just think what happened in Georgia is the greatest example of that, where people moved mountains and pulled it off, and they flipped the state blue. But now, a lot of those people that did get elected are now passing crazy voter suppression laws. Like, there's a lot of new voter suppression that's getting put on the ballots now in a lot of states where elections were lost. So you can march and you can put on the shirt and go vote, vote, vote. But if you still got people that are going to rezone and redistrict and gerrymander to the point where people can't, where your vote doesn't have the power that it needs to have, what can you do? I almost wonder if this is a conversation of two things that need to happen in conjunction with one another, because maybe in that vocalizing and changing people, maybe then we have opportunities to influence policy. The thing that gives me the most hope is that we still have a lot of youth that are more aware now.
Right. I mean, I get all that. You have to have policy. You have to have politics. You have to have people who are organizing. You have to have people who are ability to vote. But I mean, the thing that you can't, what we're dealing with here is not something that's new. I mean, this has happened forever. The Civil War occurred. Black people got the freedom. Alabama wrote 3 different constitutions during reconstructions when they started getting political power. Every time they got political power, the state would rewrite the Constitution to change it. In 1901, they wrote a constitution that was based entirely on the notion that we have to instill white supremacy in the law as a concept. White people are better. We have to put it in the law. So that happened. Jim Crow happened, which is exactly voter suppression and all that. No, you can't vote. We've got poll taxes. We've got this test you can't take it because I'm not going to lift you. I'm going to give you questions you can't possibly know the answer to. Every step of the way is a victory followed by a retreat, an orchestrated political retreat. Of course, it used to be Democrats, now it's Republicans. I mean, we swap parties, we swap politics, and we make everything important. We make politics seems like the most important thing. But essentially what it has been all along, regardless of party, is that white people did not want to give up power to Black people who they feared would be able to get, whatever they fear. They fear everything. And so this is a long historical trend of this happening. So none of which would have been allowed to happen, any of that, if white people of conscience, and they existed and exist, had said something. I mean, so those two things work together. There has to be political power, but there has to be voice, or it doesn't get done.
I'm going to combine two questions. We got three left, but I think I can combine two. So the first one is from Blair. Do you think the Methodist Church has accepted and learned from the poor behavior and missed opportunities? Are they addressing today's issues differently? Is there something you would like to hear from the Methodist Church? That's thing one. Has the Methodist Church changed? And so then Melissa, who was one of those 1,000 white people in Mountain Brook, thank you, Melissa, for showing up. And she's saying that she's seen some white pastors who have started to take this on, and she's encouraged. She thinks that your dad would be glad. Melissa's question is, what vision do you have for your book, if any, in moving the Methodist churches in Birmingham to not just recognize, but change their racist undercurrents? Has the Methodist Church changed? And do you think your book could help move them in that direction a little bit? Well, what would you like to hear from the Methodist Church?
And the Methodist churches that I've heard from, frankly, and those are probably the ones that are most likely to contact me. There's a spectrum within the Methodist Church, which is part of the problem. I mean, there's your left-leaning churches, your more open churches, your reconciling congregations, who are the ones who are very open about, who want everybody to come. They want Black people, they want gay people, they want people to come feel comfortable worshiping. But as a whole, and this is mostly illustrated in the schism that's really taking place in the Methodist Church right now, which is about LGBTQ rights and gay marriage, and the church is probably going to split over that. But the irony is that the church leadership, the bishops and such, are using exactly the same language now. The opponents of acceptance are using the exact same language now that they used in the 60s to decry integration. And the bishops are quiet about it because they don't want to lose people in the seats and the pews. They see declining membership. They don't want it to happen. And so I think that it's a real opportunity, in all these issues.
But then that just sounds like churches almost run like businesses that choose not to get into politics because they want to sell product to people on both sides of the political aisle.
Bingo. In the book I call it Jesus. I came to fear that my family was, ladder climbers and the business of, Jesus LLC, which is not, what Jesus was about. I think that you can, there's so much study up here. There's so much study about how many people have left the church in recent years, and how, the number of people who claim no religion at all is now, the nuns, as they call them, is now equal to that of the evangelical Christians, which is considered, the most powerful, political force. So, there's a lot of people leaving the church, and there's a lot of people, I think, who are leaving the church because they don't see the church acting like they believe that Jesus would want. So I think there's a lot of fear about hypocrisy, and there's a lot of people who want their churches to show love and openness to everybody. And the ironic part is that the Methodist Church has claims to be open to everybody, but it just doesn't always equate to that.
So we'll get out of here on this last question. What did you? Well, Mary just asked a great question too. You got like 5 extra minutes, brother.
I got it. If you got it, I got it.
Let's do these 2 questions. Let's do these 2, and then we'll wrap. Okay, what did you learn about Birmingham that you might not have known while working on this book? I keep learning stuff about Birmingham. I thought I knew. I learned Alabama history, and the only thing I learned about Birmingham was Dr. King was in jail there. We used to make steel, and we would have been as big as Atlanta if we had voted yes on the airport in the 1950s.
Well, my theory on that is that, people don't know that Birmingham and Atlanta were about the same size in 1950. And you can say it was
They don't know.
You can say it was about the airport, but I think that Atlanta had that slogan, we're the city too busy to hate, and Birmingham wasn't that busy. And so,
touche.
Yeah, and I've been writing a lot about Birmingham a long time, so I don't know that I learned that much about Birmingham, but I learned a lot about the institutions of white Birmingham and how deeply it was ingrained that opposition to desegregation was way more deeply ingrained in the good people of Birmingham than I would have imagined.
Well, you know what? Then that dovetails into Mary's question. Wonderful job, Mary. This is a beautiful question to close on. You're not sure if you learned anything about Birmingham, but let's talk about the people of Birmingham. Mary's question, John, did you ever understand why your father was braver in deed than in speech?
I have theories about it. And I think that first and foremost, my dad was a company man, in that, his father was a Methodist preacher, and his father was a Methodist preacher, and his father was a Methodist preacher, and he loved the Methodist church as much as he loved anything. And I think that he looked, there's a book, the Methodist Book of Discipline, which is, it tells, what you're supposed to do and what you believe and all that. And it's ridiculously, in my mind, ridiculously legalistic set of rules for some religion that, from somebody who said, love your neighbor, which seems to be the crux of it to me, rather than this book of legal stuff. But he loved his church, and he was loyal to it. And they basically said, this is not something we really are going to talk about right now. And so he wasn't talking about it. There's an academic that I quote in the book who had studied that in the Methodist Church, and how there was a real push to keep politics out of the pulpit. You separate politics from the pulpit. That's just the way you do it, which he rightly scoffs at, because a choice to not put politics in the pulpit is an inherently political choice. I mean, if I say I'm not going to talk about the rights of Black people, that is the choice to not address issues of race it's obviously political. The same is true today on any one of the issues we could think about. So, but I think it was a company line position, and that's it.
Well, I cannot thank you enough for asking me to have this conversation with you, because what you're doing is bold. You've always been that in your writing about a lot of different things, but to do a journey into yourself, that's a whole nother level. The book is Shaking the Gates of Hell. There is a link in the chat for you to order that book from the Harvard Bookstore. Also, donate to the Harvard Bookstore, pretty please. We've got to support these independent booksellers and keep them open during unprecedented times. Brother Archibald, there's also one last message in the Q&A from your wife, and she is saying, once I have the COVID vaccine, I can come over for food. I think that's, yes. Yes, if nothing else, this chat has earned me a good old Southern meal. I don't like for my collard greens to touch my macaroni. Respectfully, Alicia. Thank you.
You came to the right place. Thank you, Roy. I really appreciate you doing this, and I enjoyed talking to you. Good to see you.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to the folks at Harvard.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to John and Roy for this amazing talk tonight. And thank you to all of you out there for sharing your evening with us. Please, as Roy said, learn more about this book and purchase Shaking the Gates of Hell at the link that I've posted in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I just want to say have a good night, keep reading, and please be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.